Part 2 covers the air filter replacement and most of the panel installation. Continuing, I'll finish the oil filter replacement, taking precautions to ensure the engine is not started without oil. Moving to the rear of the bike, we remove the muffler and rear wheel as required to service the final drive fluid and the drive shaft splines. There are 4 M5 by 50 millimeter long screws that hold it on. They are very long and can be pulled out after unscrewing with a magnetic tipped bit. The cover is indexed onto the airbox with some offset tabs near the fuel cap and needs some slight wiggling to disengage. Okay, now one of the things that this kind of jiggled around a little bit when I was taking off the cover, but you gotta, there's two parts to this. There's the hold down plastic clamp and then the flimsy air filter itself that comes out. Whatever comes out of this, there's a ring that holds a lot of sand around the edge of where the air filter actually mates and holds tight here. This needs to be cleaned out with something. You can either use cotton swab that is just slightly moistened to get out all the sand, so when you put in a new filter you don't have sand that could get down inside the airbox. So here's a little portable vacuum. We're going to vacuum around the little area where sand builds up inside this box. Okay, this is the first time this bike has had a 12,000 mile, 20K service, and so the engine's in a really tight condition. It's not having a lot of blow-by gases inside the combustion going into the crankcase. This is the vent tube where all the crankcase vapors are drawn into the intake system. So as these bikes start to get more and more miles on them, this may be a place where lots of oil will come up and contaminate the inside of the air filter or the airbox. So it's just something to look at, to keep track of and clean if it starts to get a buildup of debris in there. This is an aftermarket air filter. I buy them from a supply house and I get them 6 at a time, and it turns out that the price is way down. So this is equivalent to the factory air filter in all regards. And so one of the things that I do with it is I write the date and the mileage on the end of the filter. So today is, okay, so now it's time to put this back in. You put the frame housing around and the whole thing sets back down inside the channel that you vacuumed out. All the bosses line up on the top of the airbox. This thing can only go in one way. I like to start it from the back part with the screws out. It just goes in a lot better with the screws out. Sometimes you have to move the tank back, just kind of pull the fuel tank back just a little bit, and it sits right in. There's a tab. One tab goes on the inside, one tab goes on the outside, inside the back of the cover. And then these screws all need to be torqued down. Once the air filter cover is back on and you've torqued it properly, it's ready to, it's your time to put the rest of the plastic back on in reverse order. And it's kind of hard to get it fitted down in there with just your fingers, so it almost works better to use the driver. So now it's time to just take the board in the reverse process. If you can see from the side view of how all the screws sit on an elevated plane, you get an idea of the numbers of collars, length of threads, shoulders, no shoulders. This really demystifies what lots of people fill up a used tuna can full of screws, and they have no idea where they really go. So this is just my method of making sure that things go back where they're supposed to hold them on here properly. Okay, so you just kind of fit the contour of this panel, but now you got to start hooking these little tabs into the slots in the centerpiece since you started with that. So the first one clicks in, the second one clicks in, it just follows right on down. And now we're going to get the panels out of the right hand side panel, and this is the front outside. So this is the pin, the indexing pin that's on the front of the left hand and right hand storage compartments. It's got to go inside of that little hole right in here. So it is possible to get that pin down below the plastic and crooked instead of there, just slid right into the hole. You have to get it, it just indexes and this slides straight in, and now it's in position, and the only one that holds on this is this top screw right up here. And since this has the central locking, got the wire loom to put on, that's in. Okay, the location for the speaker replacement is critical that this pin, this tab, goes into this slot right here. It has to go underneath the front glare shield. So it takes a little bit of sliding to get all the pieces in at once, and this has to go underneath there for this to align properly. It can be installed with this plastic overlapping the top of the glare shield. The power to the glove box locking, and then you have the accessory plug that's going to go on over here. This sits on a little bit of a ledge for indexing. Okay, since this has the add-on Clearwater Darla lights, it comes with the factory BMW arm, and it's just a little bit of a impedance here to get the panel back in. So you just have to fish it in to that part first, and then get the shroud to go on the radiator output. And the first thing that you need to do is locate the pins and the tabs up along the fuel tank. Once they're located, then all the rest of the screw holes line up. So you have to line up the two pins that go in the tabs, and then you have the pins and the dual lock that have to be put in. So you first line up the pins on the top, and they just fit right in. And then the dual lock, you hear it snap. And now with these pieces of tape on here, you can tell where those pins are that you need to seat in the rubber properly. Okay, just as a follow-up to make sure that because this bike has central locking, you install the wire connector for it. This is the audio panel. So that panel clicks on. This one sits on a ledge up here. These locate where this panel goes. As you remember, when we started this evolution, the bike was hot, and that's the time to drain the engine oil and to drain the filter. So I loosened the filter with the wrench. It's finger tight now, but I drilled holes in it to let the oil out of the canister. If you don't do the holes in the canister itself, you can get one of these things. It's called a forma funnel, and you can shape it. It has some kind of a lead or soft metal between the plastic layers, and you can shape it and put it right up against the crank case, and then it will deflect all of the oil off of your header. So we'll see how much oil is still left in here after we drilled the holes and drained it. Couple of drops. You need to inspect to make sure that the gasket did not stay on the side of the crank case, is still inside your filter, so that you don't stack your gaskets if you put on a new filter. You get the new filter. I like to put a small amount of used oil on here just to wet the gasket so that it doesn't have a rubber lock weld itself to the side of the crankcase when you're trying to get it off later. Newton meters. Okay, so this one came with a brand new crush washer. It fits right on here, and then it now we have to remember somehow, and I'm going to wrap some tape around the throttle to remind us that the crankcase is empty until we take off the cylinder head covers and do the valve check, the timing check, and the valve clearance check. We're going to lose oil out of the head covers, so we're not going to put new oil in just to lose oil out of the other cover anyway. So underneath here by the oil filter on the left hand side of the engine, this is the weep hole for a water pump seal leak, and you can see the evidence of the stain of the blue coolant coming down the side, and there's a little bit still in the hole. So this one has some kind of an issue with the coolant coming out of the water pump. Now that we've noted that there's a small leak from the weep hole from the water pump, you can look and see the coolant level in the reservoir. The line that is cast into the housing right here is the minimum line. So it needs to be above that. And in this case, it still is. So that leak is very minor on the water pump. Okay, now we're going to remove the muffler. So start over here with removing the heat shield. You can check this on every single key on event. The actuator for the exhaust flap moves full throw and reports to the computer that it's functioning properly. When you take these screws off this heat shield, the shield is right, the screw that goes down here on the bottom that's closest to the catalytic converter has a metal washer on it. So when you put these back together, the metal washer under the screw goes right next to the catalytic converter where all the heat is. But the first thing we're going to be doing is backing the nut onto the stud where it's burned on all the road film that's there. So I take a small brush and give it a little bit of a brush down, and then I'm going to put a little copper slip right on the threads. Now the muffler comes straight off, and at this point you can look inside the exhaust pipe, what's left of the header pipe right aft of the catalytic converter. And as I said, every time there's a key on cycle, the flap checks itself. Okay, now to remove the wheel, it's pretty easy to do this with just drop it in first gear, and then these are M10 bolts, so it's a T50 Torx that fits on there. Now to drain the final drive fluid, I always like to loosen the fill hole first. This is a 6mm Allen. If you can't loosen the fill hole, it makes it really hard to recover from a stripped bolt or something. And this has an O-ring on it, a neoprene O-ring. This should be replaced every time as well. The normal fill quantity on this is 180 milliliters. And it used to be a larger volume, and they changed it a couple years ago. Okay, the only other thing that still needs to be disconnected in order to drop the final drive is you have to disconnect the speed sensor. The little ring right up here. This is also, because this is an electrical circuit, this has a tiny bit of metallic buildup on it as well, because it has an electromagnetic coil. Okay. Once the speed sensor is disconnected from the inside of the brake rotor, you need to remove the bolts that hold the caliper on. These are just T40s. And they feel pretty hard coming out the first time. It's like they have a locking compound on them. Okay, I'm going to service the brakes later. Instead of having the caliper hang on the weight, hang on the brake line, I have a small bungee here that I just suspend from the handhold up here. Keeps the brake line from going into a bind. You can loop the speed sensor up in here too, so that these things don't get damaged. Okay, the bolt that holds the parallel arm is a T50, and it is really torqued down tight on here, and it's hard coming out all the way. So now what I'm really looking for here, the next step that's the most important move, is to open up the accordion, the boot here in the back, and you do that by breaking the tabs loose. You release the tabs from the pair lever, not from the final drive side. So there's 4 tabs under here, and you basically just push the backing plastic in, and the tabs come down and off of the inner ring of the final drive. Getting the accordion boot out is probably the hardest part of the whole final drive service. There, now it's got all the tabs are loose, and it's time to get the splines to come loose off the final drive. And if they don't come out smoothly, sometimes you have to rotate the disc, which rotates the drive shaft at the same time. And okay, we've got a little bit of a problem here. The shaft is pulling off of the front output shaft spline of the transmission. So when I first started after I got the tabs loose from the accordion and I first started to pull this down, the whole U-joint on this side of the drive shaft started coming with the final drive, which meant that the shaft was pulling loose from the output shaft of the transmission end of the spline shaft. So I had to work it to get it to come off of the final drive and stay in the pair lever itself. Now this can go straight down and hang down here, and it's still probably not on the snap rings up there. So we're going to, and if you see it move in and out like this, it's disengaged from the snap ring up on the output shaft of the transmission, and this needs to be reseated in here. So we'll get to that in a little bit. It probably won't go back together easily with the snap ring not seated up there and the drive shaft not fully inside the paralever. If you look at the output shaft, the splines of the final drive itself, they're actually in really good shape. This is the first one out of 5 that I've seen that's not rusted. So this one's in good shape. It's probably a function of not having ridden very much in wet conditions, and it's probably dry inside here. We're going to do a close inspection to see if it's dry inside the paralever tube. One of the precautions in the maintenance manual is to not let this thing flop down. There are 2 bosses underneath here that touch each other that stop the final drive from going too far, and if you just let the final drive come down and touch the boss gently and don't put any more force on it, that'll support the final drive. Otherwise, it's supposed to be strapped up so that the weight of the final drive is supported by a strap to the rest of the bike. Okay, so when the drive shaft has been unseated from the circular clip up at the end of the drive shaft, you can just put your thumbs on the end of the splines, the end of the yoke of the drive shaft, get a hold of the pivot bolt here, and just push it firmly forward, and it snapped back into the annular ring of the output shaft of the transmission. So now it's seated in the proper position, so when we re-engage the splines from the final drive into here, it'll be at the correct length. If it's sticking out 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch, it won't engage. Okay, so in order to service the accordion boot, there are 3 tabs, one on each side and one on the top, that hold the boot to the final drive. So you just push them until you hear the audible click, and it's unhooked from these little tabs. There's one here, identical one right there, and one here at the top. And then engage this clip here, and this clip here, and this clip here. There's nothing on the bottom. So this surface is supposed to be completely sealed with this grease. NBU 30 PTM. Straight out of the service manual, that's what this calls for, to seal from water intrusion into this area, as well as this whole area up here was supposed to be treated with that lube. So we're going to clean all this up from the sandy debris that's already started to make its way into here, and we're going to coat all this surface. The contact surface is going to go to the paralever and to the inside of the final drive. This is the service manual, calls for, it's a Castrol Optimal TA paste, and it doesn't take much, but you need to get it all the way down inside the bottom of the, I'm just going to put a little bit on the final drive shaft anyway. The next part that gets lubed is the boot itself, and the correct service manual lubricant for that is NBU 30 PTM. This stuff must be based in gold because it's so expensive. Even a small portion of it is so expensive. So I'm just going to put a small layer and work this around underneath the lip of the boot, where it's going to contact the inside of the final drive. It's going to lock into the inside of the final drive and to the inside of the paralever and final drive. Both get a little bit of a layer of this. Now it's time to put the boot back in order to put these 2 halves together. So you can seat the one in the final drive first, and each side and the top need to go down until you hear the audible click. In my experience, absolutely essential to get this job done, and that is you have to pull the drive shaft up into alignment so that the lower yoke can hang down, but the upper part of the drive shaft, the end of the drive shaft, has to be pulled up. So you have to have a small piece of wire. This is probably maybe 15 inches long. It's just some flexible wire, copper wire, and with some insulation on it so it'll slide. And you route it through the part of the open yoke of the drive shaft so that the flexible part of the splined joint will hang down. And just kind of line it up, point it downhill, because you can see the orientation, the way this is going to come up and engage that. So now we just start to pull this up until the two pieces start to come together. And sometimes it takes a little bit of a turn and a lift. And there it's in. And then you pull this through and it's all done. Now you got to engage, and you can watch the drive shaft turn and see that everything's engaged properly when you move the brake rotor. So now you got to get the two bottom tabs in and the two top ones. And you kind of just pull back on the edge of the accordion boot and push into the soft part where the plastic backer is. And you look along here, that is not completely seated. So it's got to go down, the lip has got to go down in the back, in the bottom. It's not in. So this is a really fiddly bit to get hooked in here right so that you don't leave an open void in the future for water to come in. Now you got to have the bolt handy to hang this so that all your work doesn't fall apart in your hands. You can just hang it on there, and then you can inspect inside here to see that all of these parts of the sealing ring are engaged in the lip inside the final drive. And then, of course, wipe off the greasy mess.